welcome to this Fuse seminar, part of the seminar series we've been having on COVID-19. I'm Sheena Ramsay. I'm chairing this session. I'm a clinical senior lecturer and honorary consultant in public health at Newcastle University. I lead the theme on healthy aging at Fuse with my colleague, Dr. Gemma Wilson from Northumbria University. I'll just leave up a slide here while we wait for others to join on some rules of engagement for today, which will really help the webinar go smoothly. So can I just request everyone to keep your microphones muted and to stop your video. It'll just help with the streaming quality. We will have plenty of time later after the presentation by Professor Tom Scharf to allow time for discussion and questions. So if you could hold off until then, but continue to put in questions in the chat box. And if you have any cause for concern, please drop a message to Ruth Wilson, who's a host through the chat box again. So yeah, just a warm welcome to everybody to our seminar series today on media representation of older people during COVID-19. And our presenter is Professor Thomas Scharf at Newcastle University. I'll introduce Tom in a moment. But before that, I'd just like to take a moment to introduce Fuse. I think most colleagues today might have heard of Fuse, but for those who are not very familiar with Fuse, just to let you know about what it is. So Fuse is a center of excellence in translational public health research. It's a virtual center which operates across 5 Northeast universities: Durham, Newcastle, Northumbria, Teesside and Sunderland. And the USP of Fuse really is translational research in public health. We work closely in partnership with policymakers and practitioners to work on research that is relevant for policy and practice. And Fuse is a founding member of the NIHR School for Public Health Research. We have a number of themes, research programs or themes as part of Fuse listed here. And one of the themes is healthy aging. And as part of that research program, we're running this webinar today. Also, just to mention Ask Fuse. So Ask Fuse, some of you may have heard of it. It's a rapid response and evaluation service for policy and practice partners who can reach out to Fuse. And it's really a way of working collaboratively with policy practice partners on pressing public health issues. There's a website and link for Ask Fuse on this slide. So if you're not familiar with Ask Fuse or Fuse more generally, I'd encourage you to go and have a look at the website. So now on to the main part of the webinar for today. I have great pleasure in welcoming Professor Tom Scharf. Many of us will have heard and know of Tom. Tom is a professor of social gerontology at Newcastle University. Before joining Newcastle University in 2016, Tom was in Galway, Ireland. Tom is currently the president of the British Society for Gerontology. And I'm sure Tom doesn't really need a lot of introduction. We will have known of Tom's research in aging and ageism, particularly around social exclusion and inclusion. And Tom has been writing and speaking quite a bit, especially around what we've been hearing and seeing about in these recent months around COVID-19. And in fact, the topic for today's webinar was suggested at one of the previous COVID-19 seminar series. And Tom, there was a special request for you to speak on this topic, given the expertise that you have in this area. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from you, Tom. And thank you so much for your time and agreeing to speak to us today. So over to you, Tom.
Thanks very much, Sheena, for the kind introduction and also for giving me the opportunity to share some slides with you. I hope that the slides aren't too distressing or too inappropriate for people who are tuning in to listen. So what I really wanted to do was to focus on some, I'd say, preliminary thoughts that have started to engage me over the course of 2020 in particular. So I'll be focusing on the ways in which older people in later life have been represented through the media over the course of the pandemic. What I'll be doing is I'll be starting with a few words around the connections between COVID-19 and aging before connecting the work on media representations to my own interest around social exclusion in later life and existing work around ageism. I'll then introduce the idea of visual ageism before showing you some of the ways in which aging in later life have been represented in the media over the course of 2020. And I'll finish up with some concluding thoughts that really will lead into a discussion. And so I hope that I leave enough time for a discussion. I'm able to pick up on some of the questions that will come into the sort of chat box. So the context for the presentation, I think it's something that's really worth reminding ourselves of, is the way in which the COVID-19 pandemic has really hit older people. There's sometimes, it's obvious to people working in the field of aging and gerontology that this is actually the case. But that sometimes gets lost, that, the sense that we're dealing with really serious issues during the course of a major national crisis. So only yesterday, the Office for National Statistics published their latest data to show that there were over 77,000 confirmed deaths from COVID-19 in the United Kingdom. And sometimes missing from that type of headline information is the basic fact that 90% of all coronavirus deaths have occurred amongst people aged 65 and over. So this is a pandemic that affects all of us, but in terms of mortality outcomes is especially places older people especially at risk of mortality. And then when we come into thinking about where these deaths are located, there's also a disproportionate number of deaths linked to coronavirus within care homes. 17,889 deaths in care homes in England and Wales is the latest data. And where they collect excess mortality data, we know that in care homes over the course of the pandemic, there have been over 25,000 excess deaths. So this really is what I would regard as the sort of serious background to thinking about the connections between COVID-19, aging, and the way in which that is represented within the media. And my work historically hasn't really been about visual representations of aging. My work really has focused on questions around social exclusion, social inclusion in later life. And what I wanted to do here was to try and connect ideas on exclusion to ideas on ages and to show how, for me, this fits together. So we can think of social exclusion as being a multidimensional process of progressive social rupture that detaches groups and individuals from social relations and institutions and prevents them from full participation in what people would really regard as a normal set of activities of daily life within the societies in which we live. And we have transformed in some of our work that broad understanding of social exclusion for a general population into a focus on the ways in which older people in particular may be affected by different characteristics of exclusion, forms of exclusion which are important in later life. And this is work that I did with colleagues in Ireland and also in Canada, and has underpinned the RoseNet Cost Action, which is an EU-funded program looking at reduction of social exclusion in later life. And we developed a sort of definition of social exclusion that really focused on the relevance of these different issues for older people, but taking also on a life course perspective. So we describe exclusion as being a complex process that involves the lack or denial of resources, rights, goods and services as people age, and the inability to participate in the normal relationships and activities available to most people. And this complex chart, if you like, really reflects the different dimensions of exclusion that have been explored in research on the topic. So broad areas like civic participation, material and financial resources, with a range of indicators, sub-dimensions associated with them. And also important, of course, is the way in which these different dimensions and indicators interact with each other. So thinking about ageism and visual representations of later life takes us into the sphere of exclusion on the sociocultural domain, which also has its subcomponents which are relevant to what I'll be presenting here. So we can talk about symbolic exclusion. This was based on the work of Amanda Grenier and Nancy Gubman. Symbolic exclusion encompasses the negative representations of particular groups and or the invisibility of such groups within society. And we also get identity forms of exclusion, which is around the dismissal or diminishment of distinct multiple identities of people, of groups, via their reduction to a single identity, an identity such as age. The bridge into this then is to think about, sociocultural exclusion within that context of ageism as a sort of next step, ageism being the complex, often negative construction of old age, which takes place at the individual and also at the societal levels. In historic work on the topic by Julia Johnson and Bill Bythway, they go deeper into examining different forms of ageism, all of which I would say have been prevalent across the course of the pandemic throughout 2020. We can think about an institutionalized form of ageism, which is reflected in the structures of our society, internalized ageism, which, for example, reflects negative types of things that people say, the language of ageism, and also then this idea of benevolent patronage, the sense that older people are vulnerable as a group and need looking after and need caring for by a paternalistic society. So these features of ageism have been really important over the course of the pandemic. But what I wanted to draw attention to here, which is the real context for the presentation, really is a particular form of ageism which has been described as visual ageism. This is the social practice of visually underrepresenting older people or misrepresenting older people in a prejudiced way. So coming from a perspective on social exclusion, I would say that visual ageism coincides with forms of symbolic and identity exclusion. And this is where we get into some of the awful images. And again, I repeat that I'm going to apologize for the choice of images that you're going to be seeing over the next few minutes. What I really want to show is how prevalent these images are and how damaging they are in terms of older people and representations of later life. And for me, this is also then part of the context that turns a blind eye when so many older people perish over the course of a pandemic. Why are we not on the streets? Why are we not saying that this is something that is really serious? So I'm going to start off with what looks like a relatively benign image, an image that is widely used in national and international media. It's been used by the Financial Times, by the Guardian, ITV, all over the place. Right, a sort of pretty standard image of old age. And what's characteristic about the images that I'm sharing is that just how widespread they are and how they're used in so many different ways to by media organizations to illustrate a story that they're trying to tell. So the same image here is used to relate to stories around COVID shielding, the fact that nursing home residents, staff may be exhausted and drained by the difficult caring roles that they've been fulfilling over the course of the pandemic. This image can be used to illustrate a story about legal challenges that have prevented family members, friends from visiting relatives and homes. It can be used to illustrate stories around unmet care needs. So an incredibly versatile image for a hard-pressed picture editor at a news organization. But what we really see is that that image is part of a whole series of images on the image and in the image libraries where stock images are filed away that all share similar common themes. We see the ubiquity of older people's hands, the ubiquity of hands holding onto sticks or being supported by other people's hands. And I would regard this as a relatively straightforward visual misrepresentation of older people in a prejudiced way, where old age is reduced to a single identity, to a single negative identity. So even though we have images of men's hands and women's hands, and different types of walking support, but this really isn't a very positive or accurate reflection of a diversity of a heterogeneous older population. Sticks can be incredibly helpful as mobility devices for older people. So I'm not sure what media organizations have, what their real concerns are in terms of representing old age with a stick. What these stock images emphasize are a whole host of negative ageist associations that characterize later life, that lead to a situation where we accept that older people's deaths are perhaps less valuable than the deaths of other people within the population, that these images are associated with the characteristics of frailty, vulnerability, dependency, decline, proximity to death, and in many cases, we touch on issues around isolation and loneliness. And we've all seen these images in our social media, in our print media, in different places where issues around aging in later life are represented. It's not just hands, of course. We also see other parts of older people's bodies. We seldom see their whole bodies, their faces, their active engagement in community and civic life. We see rows of people sat in the sort of waiting room to death. We see bottom halves of people also supported in some way by sticks and by walking devices. An image such as the one in the top left quarter here of an older person sitting on a park bench with two sticks, which if you represented the whole image of a whole person and a body of I'm presuming it's a man, you'd actually think, well, this is a different story. This is somebody who has got out of their four walls, has, with mobility problems, has managed to get themselves to a public space where they can sit down and be part of what's going on in the community around them. But by cutting off the image in this particular way, it really focuses on lack of mobility, dependency, decline. we've seen so many examples of institutionalized ageism over the course of the pandemic that sometimes major, even progressive media organizations can't help themselves but to fall back on ageist stereotypes and tropes of later life. And this was an image that was recently used in The Guardian to illustrate a story which was later withdrawn, but it shows an older woman wearing a face mask looking out of a window to illustrate a story on loneliness. And if you do a search through Google Images for loneliness, you'll see many of these types of image of people sat at a window looking into the distance. Not always wearing a face mask, of course, which is quite unusual in terms of being in one's own residence. It's not necessary. But the important thing about this particular story, which really struck me, was that the report was not about loneliness in later life, which is obviously an important issue, but the fact that the loneliness that was being reported was predominantly loneliness of younger people. So the argument here was that 16 to 29-year-olds were twice as likely as over 70s to be experiencing loneliness. But we don't get an image of younger people looking out of a window in their apartments. No, because that doesn't fit the story on loneliness, which we know loneliness and old age go hand in hand. They don't. Less than 10% of older people at any one point in time are seriously lonely. But there are all sorts of myths and stereotypes associated with loneliness that really lead a picture editor to select this type of image to illustrate a story. Nobody is immune from these visual forms of ageism. There are a number of researchers working in the field who produce excellent work that then gets mangled in some way and picked up in a way that is then associated with a visual misrepresentation of what it is they're trying to achieve. So we have colleagues at Age Platform Europe who wrote an excellent report over the course of the COVID pandemic to talking about the need for greater age equality and the need to tackle abuse in later life. So even people who have a strong focus on an active aging agenda, on a rights-based model of aging, they then find that their work is accompanied by this type of awful, ageist, stereotypical image that really says nothing about equality in later life and says everything about dependency, about inactivity, about frailty. There's a particular interest that I've had around people's material resources in later life. And these are just some images that I'm sure people can engage with, because this really is about poverty in old age. And through the hands and the coins, we can associate later life with intense financial hardship, clutching coins, right, far removed from a digital economy where people are using contactless payment cards and transferring money using digital methods. We also, over the course of the year, have seen wherever there are concerns about pensions, we see this type of image, which isn't, it's not an image of old age per se, but it is also an image that really reflects a particular view of aging in later life as being somehow financially challenging. So we have countless images of income in later life, pensions, planning for retirement that have a jam jar with coins in it. I would say I'm not qualified as a financial advisor, but if this was your retirement saving, if this was your pension planning, you really need to join a trade union and to take some serious financial advice. I'm not sure what's going on with this particular set of images, but this is far removed from the reality of most people's arrangements for their financial independence in later life. I've been using in my talk photographic images, but there are other sorts of images that illustrate the points I'm keen to make around visual representations of later life and the nature of visual ageism. And this one really hit home for me on so many levels, and you could write a scientific paper on this image alone, I'm quite sure. So what we see is the stooped couple with the walking stick, enclosed in a glass ball, held in two hands. And on so many different levels, this really reflects that benevolent form of ageism, but in a visual, highly visual way. It's an image that is used around the world in different media organizations to represent a particularly paternalistic, negative stereotyping of older people and later life that is just so far removed from what social gerontology would have to say about aging in later life and the contributions that people are making. It's just really beyond the pale. I could have given my presentation solely focusing on the negative stereotypes of aging that focus on dependency and decline. I also wanted to just share with you my equally valid concerns about the ways in which other groups of older people are sometimes represented in the media. So we also have visual forms of ageism reflected in what some might call positive images of aging, images associated with successful models of aging, which can also be prejudicial. In this case, I would say prejudicial in the extent of contributing to the potential for tensions between generations. So this is a photo composite from the New York Post that shows a classic baby boomer couple, right? Silver hair, linen tops, denim trousers on a yacht with the ocean ahead of them. But in this case, because that didn't quite make the point subtly enough, there's been a few banknotes thrown in just to make the point that so-called boomers are a highly privileged group within society who really should probably be doing more to share their resources around more equally across society. So I wanted to sort of wind up here and to lead into the discussion with just some concluding thoughts. And I do emphasize that this work, I regard this as still preliminary ideas that aren't really fully worked up, but just something that has come my way over the course of 2020. What I would say is that there is I think there's a value in terms of the science of connecting debates on social exclusion to debates on ageism, in this case, debates on visual forms of ageism, because this allows us to deepen our understanding of the ways in which different forms of social exclusion, from my perspective, intersect. So we see in some of the images that I've been using here, exclusion from the socio-cultural domain, linking with exclusion on the services dimension in terms of people's access to services, to their transport and mobility needs, to exclusion on the basis of social relationships. So we see negative visual representations of loneliness and social isolation. We see a lack of civic participation, a lack of citizenship reflected in stereotypical media representations and such. And one of the ways in which this type of agenda can be taken forward, which is crucial in terms of a social exclusion approach, is to think about the dynamic nature of exclusion. So what we can also do is think about the representations of later life also in their dynamic form, is to think about how issues that occur across the life course are then reflected in visual ways. So I'm thinking here about people aging with disabilities, as how people with those complex identities have been represented right through their lives in potentially negative and stereotypical ways, and that then becomes even more reinforced in later life to create a really deep-seated sense of disconnection from what passes as mainstream or normal life. The second set of conclusions really are around what we should be doing about this, why we should be taking this seriously. And I think what COVID-19 has really revealed is the need for much more urgent thinking about challenging ageism in its different forms. That really this is, from my perspective, why we failed so badly in terms of protecting older people from the hazards of COVID-19, is that really from the beginning we didn't take seriously enough the risks posed to older people, and that reflects a deep-seated institutionalized form of ageism within society. Now, I've used a lot of images from media organizations. Part of the solution to visual ageism is to collaborate with media organizations to change the ways in which they represent aging and later life. So I'm not saying, right, they've got to do this, they've got to do that. I've got to say we've got to do this together to educate and inform, and to then bring about a cultural change that better reflects the way the lives of a diverse older population. We can also think about restructuring the demand and supply of images of aging in later life. So this implies working with media organizations so that they don't go into picture libraries and choose the first images of wrinkled hands to represent their stories, but look further down through the image banks to find better, more accurate representations of aging in later life. But we also need to work with the picture libraries and image banks themselves to reduce the stock of wrinkled hands images and to increase the stock of better, more diverse images. And there's been some really helpful work around this from the Cochrane Library that has recently developed guidelines on the non-stigmatizing use of visual images for a range of purposes. And it's done in a really nice way and explains why the wrinkled hands images are not appropriate and why there are other images that may be better used. And I think we can enhance and develop these guidelines in the future. I'd like to sort of finish with something that is a much better story. Having put the slides together, I thought I've got to find an image that better reflects the contributions and the diversity of aging in later life. And what better than the powerful image yesterday of Margaret Keenan receiving her COVID-19 vaccine. Somebody in their 90s who clearly isn't frail, isn't vulnerable, is independent, is engaged in society, and is also making an active contribution to society by taking the vaccine, which is just so important. And I thought these were such powerful images that moved away from the standard discourse around vulnerability and aging. So I thought I would end up with a more positive note. some references. The slides will be shared, I'm sure, at a later point. But at that stage, I'm going to stop sharing the screen and pick up on questions and head into a discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Tom. That was really, really excellent. Thank you. If we were in a room, we would be applauding at this point. But yeah, that was really great. And I haven't actually heard a talk on this topic. And I think one of the things I was struck by is just, I mean, of course we know about ageism, but I think just how subtle it's been. I think that's the thing that struck me is, I suppose it's prevalent, but it's kind of, we become so accustomed to this that we almost stop questioning it. And also, I suppose the other thing I was struck by was the positive, that even positive images have some level of prejudice in it. So that was really interesting. I mean, I don't know if so can I just request anyone, please put your questions in the chat box, or just put your hand up and we'll call out. So yeah, that's a few minutes for
I think it's interesting, Sheena, that you talk about the subtle ageism. I really don't regard these images as being especially subtle. I think it's the quantity, and maybe it's just because of my Twitter presence, where people have started now sharing these images with me. So I just feel this has become part of my life over the course of the last 10 months. And, at one level you can say, oh, you could ignore it and say, oh, this is, but then you become part of the problem, that they're so culturally embedded that we need to really use this year as a time to sort of make a break and say, well, actually, we need to do things differently and to do things better, because how else can we live in a society that tolerates such a tragic loss of life and such a scale amongst a particular part of the population, something that Margaret Morgenroth would describe as eldercide. And it's very hard to say, actually, that isn't an accurate reflection of what's been going on here.